Good afternoon, everyone. A full auditorium always makes my heart sing, especially on a beautiful day. Welcome to the Portland Art Museum. My name is Julia Dolan. I'm the minor white curator of photography, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today for our 6th annual Arnold Newman Distinguished Lecture in Photography. Before I introduce our speaker, Fazal Sheikh, I would like to take a brief moment to extend my thanks to a number of people who have made this lecture, as well as the Common Ground exhibition and education program possible. First, we would not be here today were it not for the generosity of the Arnold and Augusta Newman Foundation, which was established in 2007 to honor and further Arnold Newman's photographic legacy. Because of the foundation's gift to the museum, Carrie Mae Weems, Richard Moss, Emmett Gowan, Jun Lee, and Dawood Bey have spoken to community members and worked with students and docents here. In January, the foundation generously offered the museum a second 5-year series, which begins today. Arnold and Augusta Newman's son, David Newman, and David's wife, Deirdre Steinberg, are Portland residents, and they are here with us today. David and Deirdre, not exactly sure where you are, but I know you're out there. Thank you so much for your family's continued generosity and for making these very special lectures possible. A number of sponsors who helped bring the Common Ground exhibition to Portland are also here today, including Daniel Bergsvik and Donald Hastler, Sandy and Jeff Grubb, Stephanie Fowler and Irving Levin of the Renaissance Foundation, and Jonathan Combs and his team members from Pro Photo Supply. Many thanks to all of you. I would also like to thank the museum's absolutely outstanding education team and our community partners who have provided knowledge and resources for the outreach programming that supports Common Ground. These partners include Manuel Padilla of Portland Meet Portland, Jimmy Dogo of Africa House, KK Wah of the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization, Wajdi Saeed of the Muslim Educational Trust, and Suba Ganesan, Portland's creative laureate and founder and director of New Expressive Works. And now I am delighted to introduce today's Arnold Newman Distinguished Lecturer in Photography, Fazal Sheikh. For more than 25 years, Fazal has centered his practice on amplifying the voices of the marginalized, primarily through the photographic portrait. Since graduating from Princeton University in 1987, he has worked with dispossessed communities throughout much of the world. He has received many awards for his work, and I do emphasize many, including but not limited to fellowships from the Fulbright Program, the National Endowment for the Arts, the MacArthur Foundation, and the Guggenheim Foundation. He has also received the Leica Medal of Excellence, the Henri Cartier-Bresson International Grand Prize, the Lucy Humanitarian Award, and photography book awards, including the Krasna Kraus Book Award. He has published over 15 books of his work, many of which have been distributed free of charge or are available online under the International Human Rights Series imprint. His photographs have been exhibited in and collected by museums throughout the world, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the Photo Museum Winterthur, and the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. We are so pleased that this is his first exhibition in Portland, and we are incredibly fortunate to have him here with us today in Portland. Please join me in welcoming Fazal Sheikh.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And before I begin, I'd just like to say a couple moments of thank yous to a couple of people, because last spring I was invited to Princeton to participate in a small panel that was addressing the notion of how to sustain a life in activism. and I was meant to be one of the speakers. And I have to admit that at that moment in time, under the new administration, I felt so unsettled, even given all that I had perhaps accomplished in years prior. I felt unmoored, and in a way I had wondered what it is I'd been doing for all these years. And I certainly demurred from the notion that I could speak about how to sustain a life as an activist. But before responding, I thought a little bit further about it, and I realized actually that in the course of this 25 years of traveling around the world, I have in fact witnessed and been amongst people that I would say truly were extraordinary activists. And I think in that moment I realized actually perhaps the best thing I could do as an artist is not to get so outside myself and what was swirling around me in my own nation of birth, but rather to focus once again on my own process, to surround myself with people who had similar notions of commitment and with whom I found heartening times. And so in that mode, the exhibition here, which I thank Julia and the whole education team especially as well, for doing such an immaculate job with making a handsome installation. But perhaps for me, even more importantly, carrying on something that happened with my friend Eric Paddock, the curator of the Denver Art Museum, where this exhibition originates. And it was this idea of opening the doors of the museum, trying to invite the broader community within that space, not isolating art, but rather asking art of its strongest and most compelling ability to traverse the lines, to establish modes of communication that I find extremely heartening. And this kind of way of working is something I've worked on for many years. I've wanted always to work within the human rights and the arts, to insist on this ability, this fluidity, that a body of work could function in various arenas. And just being with these people, in fact, the main donor of many of my exhibitions and publications over the years is with us tonight. And I think I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that without those kinds of gestures, those kinds of wonderful, heartening people, work like mine certainly would not be possible. And it's encouraging for me, it's kind of hopeful for me that there is a means for which, or by which, we can continue a conversation. So I just wanted to mention that, if I may, firstly. And the segue also is that the two publications outside are part of this mode of working, a means by which to offer the material free. In some cases it's online, in this case they're two small newspapers, one of which I won't be able to touch upon tonight, but following this conversation at Princeton about activism, I realized it was time to come back to America and to try and to contribute to the conversation here. And that piece, Exposure, is about a work that I've just started last spring with the Utah Dinebikea group, the Native American coalition that helped to win the right for the Bears Ears Monument. And of course, as most of you will know, that monument was scoured in the months after Trump took office. So it's a kind of this gesture of working together in solidarity and also trying to respond to the way in which things seem to be manipulated in our country at the moment. So I'd like to start, if I may, just with some of the earliest work. Would you mind turning the lights down a bit on me? That's not so necessary, thank you. It's funny because at Princeton I was much more interested in, let's say, maybe pseudo-conceptual work initially. I studied sculpture and painting, and my second year I started to take photography classes with Emmett Gowan, who's not only an extraordinary artist, but a wonderful human being and a dear friend. And the work I was making initially was about self-portraiture, which I'll spare you. But soon after studying with Emmett, I had the opportunity to go back to Kenya I have this mixed heritage. I was born and raised in New York, but with my father's family, having arrived from northern India, my father was born and raised in Nairobi. So I always had this ability to move fluidly from America back to Africa each year. And I began photographing in the villages that I knew. This is an image from Ama's home, her granddaughter. And they were very sort of simple, matter-of-fact photographs of the people I knew. I was able to give them photographs at the time, and I didn't really register them as having any great artistic value, frankly. It was more just a part of the day's interaction with people around me, the chance to give them something to hold from our time together. They were very basic, formal images, asking the sitter to present themselves as they felt most comfortable to the camera. And I realized very quickly that anything that I might imagine about the way in which somebody could pose for the camera often paled, or almost always paled, in comparison to the way in which a person would present themselves to the camera. So bringing these pictures back to Princeton, working on them through that next year, I think it was my junior and senior years, Emmett said to me very gently, he said, you know, I think this is maybe the work that you're meant to be undertaking, or this is your place. And I think in a way this idea that it came so naturally to me, I imagined that something had to be hard to win in order for it to have value. Toward the end of my years at Princeton, it was the late 80s, and the divestment movement had taken hold with relation to South Africa. And I was curious not only how Kenya fit within the broader African context, but what the situation was like in South Africa. And of course, the admonition in those days was to boycott, not to visit the country. But it seemed to me, if one were to visit as an artist respectfully and with a set of questions at the core of one's visit, perhaps it was more important to engage than to out-of-hand reject. And after driving and hitchhiking across Africa, I spent 6 months living in the South African homelands. Very sort of timid about my abilities as a photographer or artist, but again working in this mode of kind of collaboration. This is an image from the Boseli School for the Blind in the Lebowo homeland. And Chrissy Butterworth's neighbors in the Greektown colored location. It was the first time that I started to understand that the way in which I might apprehend or understand a place could be different from the way in which it had been presented to me in the media. And that was sort of followed on a short 2 or 3 years later when I had a Fulbright to go back to Kenya. At the time, I thought I would work on the Swahili coast where my family partially lived. But it was in that set of years, 91, 92, that 500,000 refugees had come across the borders from Ethiopia, Sudan, and Somalia. And it seemed to me, having never worked as a photojournalist, indeed, I've never tried to work in that mode since, but it seemed to me you needed to look at the most pressing issue for the country at that time. So I went to the UN High Commission for Refugees and I asked for permission to join them on one of the trips to the camps in the north. The first camp I visited was the Sudanese refugee camp at Lokichoke, which was in a remote desert area right near the border. And the protocol of those engagements is that one arrives at this local airstrip before dawn in Nairobi, a kind of lush part of Nairobi. And the UN spokesman tells you about what you're going to see in the following hours, what indeed you will experience in the camps. And as the 12 of us, primarily journalists and photojournalists, sat by, the UN spokesman talked of these 25,000 refugees, half of which had come walking across the borders, these unaccompanied minors. They were boys between the ages of 8 and 18 who had been away from the villages when the villages were attacked, the families killed or abducted. On return to the village, finding it empty, they had banded together, walking in many cases hundreds of miles through the desert in search of sanctuary at the border at Lokichokio. And the thing that's instructive for me about that is that ruminating in the back of one's mind when you traverse this distance from the capital up the 2 or 3 hours to the borderlands is this sense of what their lives, what their journey must have been. Arriving at this sandy desert spit in the north, the journalists and photojournalists immediately set about their work, going directly into the camp. They had the permission of the UN, and they never discussed, particularly with the community, a notion of permission. They worked throughout the day, and many of them left in the afternoon flight on the route back to Nairobi. And I remember feeling this sense of paralysis, of kind of extreme vulnerability. Yes, I had some tools, but I didn't feel comfortable with this idea of insinuating myself into a community that I didn't know. And so I stayed for a few days and then ultimately set upon the notion of asking the elders for their willingness to collaborate with me in documenting the nature of the camps. And I asked the elder of that one camp, a towering 7-foot Dinka named Deng Dao, if I could work with him in the camp. And he said, but why are you asking me? I'm only a refugee. But something in his offering to me made it clear what a trespass it had been for others to move through his camp within the lives of his people without ever having asked permission. I asked again over the next few days, and slowly he agreed to help me, to work with me, to instruct me on the nature of what was important in those camps. And this is from one of the first days, actually, when I started photographing there. I would ask them what was most essential. And in this case, it was the afternoon. I was on my way back to the UN compound, and they told me, you must come see the family of Akwat. I arrived, and they asked for a photograph to be made of the family. These are people, remember, who've never been photographed before in their lives. It's an image of Akwat Nubol, who's the pregnant woman at center, with her daughter Athok Dum on the left, and Athok Dum's aunt Riak Warabek on the right. So Athok Dum, in recovery from malaria, her mother and aunt choose to defer their rendering to the caring of their sickly family member. And for me, that was already extraordinary in the sense that the way in which they presented themselves to me was something I couldn't really have conjured for myself. But it showed this kind of character of solidarity. It instructed me about the notion that actually refugees may go through difficult moments in their lives, but yet they're still there to bolster one another. They are still there to recreate their sense of community. Ajo Achot and Achol Manyan in that same Sudanese camp. This is the group number 2 of the unaccompanied minors I mentioned earlier about these boys between 8 and 18. And in this case, they had been in such close proximity to the border with Sudan. At night, the Sudanese People's Liberation had been coming across into the camps and abducting the older boys to take them back to fight in the civil war in the south. So it was determined that they needed to take the boys another 50 miles within the borders of Kenya to be a safe distance from the fighting. This was something also that was very instructive to me. When you think of 12,000 boys, teenage boys nonetheless, living together in a camp. Soon after arriving, I realized that actually the older boys were shoring up the sense of family, were taking care of and nurturing the younger boys in moments of illness or weakness. Moving away from that border, I spent about 3 years working Eastern and Southern Africa, primarily in refugee communities, because I sort of soon realized that I could perhaps make a set of representations that might ask the viewer to reconsider the way in which they think about African refugees. I remember the New York Times, before I had traveled back to the region, stories that showed the Africans as sort of malnourished waifs, victims of a cruel world. Never did one have the sense that it was a community that endures. In fact, today the Somalis have lived in the camps since 1991 without cease until today. This is an image from the Mozambican border, which was a much more heartening time because the Mozambicans had come to a peace accord and they were going back from their camps in Malawi across the border to their homes. On the Ethiopian border, the Walda camp, the Gabra tribal matriarch with women and children. And on the Rwandan border, which was far more volatile at the time, it was so volatile, in fact, as you may remember, 250,000 refugees had fled across the borders in the course of a single day into Tanzania. And when one was working in the camps, it was necessary to stay at a distance from the camps and drive in with the UN each day to work in the afternoon, returning to the tented area of the UN compounds, which was quite secure. And that first set of visits, it was an area I knew well from my childhood, before the refugees arrived. And I remember sitting in the back of one of these Land Cruisers as the driver descended from a hillside down into the camp. And the first thing one entered was the crush at the marketplace. And looking out that side window, one face quickly melded into the next until it became kind of a mass of humanity. And the driver turned to me, I remember his Irish, he said, "What do you want to work in the camp of fucking murderers for?" It was this idea that you could consign 250,000 people to the role of murderer or having been complicit with murder. And much of my work has then become kind of investigations or responses to little snippets, little things that I've seen, little moments of conversations. This is an image of the traditional birthing attendant, Nira Bahiri Asteri. She sits in the middle of the image, holding the two children that she's given birth to the night before, flanked by the mothers, Kanyage and Mukanzabonimpa's mother. And the children's names that they had chosen, Nsabimana, I beg something from God, and Mukanzabonimpa, God will give me, but I do not know when. It seemed to me that reflected such an extraordinary degree of hope in the moment of great hardship. Not only that, it showed actually that the community had already begun to reconstitute itself, that they were there to take care of one another, to treat one another as they had in their homeland. An image of Wezemana, whose name means God is great, and her brother Mitonze, again from the Rwandan camps. The Somali border was perhaps the most complicated place to work. It was the most volatile at the time, and I traveled frequently up to the camps along the border, and particularly into Mandera, which was right at the border itself. And I remember always sort of steering clear of the feeding centers. One day, a German diplomat was planning his trip, and he'd sent his assistant in the morning flight to the camp with the intention to go to the feeding center to find the most malnourished child in the center. The diplomat arrived in the afternoon on a charter flight of his own, went straight to the feeding center, took the child, had a photograph taken, and then returned to Nairobi. And so I kind of have always bristled at the way in which these kinds of communities are rendered to us in the West. You know, perhaps this notion of having that dual heritage or so makes me also defensive of what I have known of those communities. And though I had stayed away from the feeding centers, a conversation with a Kenyan doctor one evening caused me to want to make a body of work there. I was sitting with a doctor at the Médecins Sans Frontières feeding center, and he told me of the incidents of families smothering their malnourished children in the border crossing from Somalia to Kenya. Such an extraordinary claim. How is this possibly true? And I asked him why that was the case. And he told me, but it is common knowledge that Somalis are aggressive by nature. So this idea also of racism, elitism, right, on the borders of Somalia. But it was such an extraordinary claim, I wanted to use the process of photography to try and investigate what his claim meant. And so I went, in fact, to the feeding center for the most malnourished children of Médecins Sans Frontières, a center which the children were brought twice daily to receive a treatment. And the images from that series, which here is shown in the museum as a kind of abbreviated grid, is a kind of visual response to this doctor's claims. The way in which the families hold the child, I think, immediately represents the sense of their caring for that family member. And so they're very, very simple, as in the rest of my work, very simple and straightforward. I just show you a few of them from that grid. Image of Fatuma Abdi Hussein and her son Abdullahi. Fatuma Muhammad Saeed and Amina Ahmad Abdi, mother of 10 children. Jama Abdullahi and her brother Adan. Shamsa Moka Abdi and her sister Shahil. Fehan Noor Ahmad and her daughter Resh. Sophia Hassan Mahmoud and her brother Itzhak. Alima Yusuf Abdi and her son Hassan. Abdiya Abdi Khalil and her son Hamid. Amina Aliyu Abdi and her son Muhammad. And Hadija and her father Badal Aden Gadel. Hadija had fled her village with the family, but had been separated from her mother in the border crossing. Her mother had actually fled to another part of Somalia. And in the time since, she had remained mute when arriving in the camp. This is something that at the time I didn't know, but that great trauma can bring about muteness. She later, in fact, I found out sometime later, was reunited with her mother, and she regained her speech. That last set of days in the feeding center, a nurse came to me one morning and told me of a mother and a child who had arrived the night before in the camp. And she arrived with only one extremely malnourished child. They were registered in the camp and then immediately brought to the center for treatment. And when they began to administer the treatment, the mother broke down. It later came to pass, in fact, that when the mother had fled their village in Somalia, she had left with 2 children, and that in the border crossing, the dozens of miles they'd walked through the desert, the elder of the 2 children had become so malnourished that the mother had in fact smothered the child. And here, in a sense, she was forced to confront the notion that rather than allowing the opportunity for her child to be revived, she might have deprived him of that chance. So this is also something that's always been very present for me, to try and interrogate the way in which my preconceptions about place, maybe the people who will view my images, their preconceptions of place need to be challenged. That I think in a documentary mode, one needs to spend time actually stripping away your sense of place, taking yourself back, remaining vulnerable at the outset, but then through that vulnerability, perhaps receptive to what a community and set of individuals have to offer. Very simple in essence. But I also realized that initial vulnerability or paralysis I'd felt in the northern camps near Sudan was actually in some ways a kind of a strength, because it implies that you're not imposing yourself on the place and the people that you're visiting. So after I'd made that first book, it's called A Sense of Common Ground, I traveled back to those camps 8 years later in search of some of the children, in fact, who had been in those feeding centers. And that first book had been very much driven by the men in the camps. Of course, in the Somali communities, the men, it's a very patriarchal society, very strongly male-oriented. But as these camps were 80% women and children, I thought it would be curious to try and make a piece that was allied with them, that was bringing their voice forward. And the starting point was looking for some of those same children who had been in the feeding center. Here's an image of Halima Abdullahi Hassan and her son Muhammad, Nimo Haret Hussein and her son Isa, grandson Isa, Salado Hassan Adan and her son Ahmad. The stirring notion for me also in that return was that these boys, the older boys who had been in the feeding center, were they in Somalia, the Somali either of their birth or birthed in the refugee camps, were they across the border, they would certainly be involved in some of the clan militia fighting today. As an aside, I should say that Kenya, where I spend much of my life still, has attempted in the last years to forcibly repatriate the Somalis, claiming that the Al-Shabaab terrorists are secreting themselves away in these camps. Quite amazingly, the judiciary forbade them from sending the Somalis home, saying that was counter to international human rights law. So that idea of kind of xenophobia, fear of the other, is something that is woven through many communities, and obviously something that troubles me greatly in the country where I was born. The book, A Camel for the Sun, is based upon the letter by this woman, Abshiro Ad Muhammad, that was given me. It had been dictated to her teenage son. She arrived at my tent one morning and asked to meet with me and gave me this letter, which talks about the situation of Somali women, not only within the refugee camps, but in the Somali of their birth as well. And it's those kinds of voices, those kinds of people who have endured for decades or more in eking out an existence in some of these refugee camps. That's the kind of activism I think is truly extraordinary. And I'm not at all sure that if I were in the same situation that I would be as brave and forthright as they have been. I just mentioned Abshiro Ad Muhammad. She'd lived in the refugee camps for more than a decade. I was invited in 2000 to work in the Netherlands, and I was asked what might interest me. And I said, well, the nature of religiosity, and I've worked much with refugee communities. And I accepted the offer to come and visit, but I had no sense of what I might work on. It was the winter, and it happened to be the month of Ramadan. And I met, soon after my arrival, coincidentally, a Somali lawyer who told me the story of Zainab Azir Wardere, whose portrait you see now. Zainab had lived actually in Mogadishu during the course of the whole war. During one afternoon, the rival clan had come into the compound of their home, and several members of her family had been killed. She herself had been violently assaulted. Such was her assault, both physically and the mental damage, that the family realized in the wake of the attack that they would have to get her to Europe for treatment. They sold the house, but only had enough money for Zainab and her son Muhammad to make the journey. She was taken to Tanzania, from where they created fake papers for her that would ostensibly take her to Denmark. But when she arrived at Osdorp in the Netherlands, they realized that she hadn't any papers. And of course, in Europe, one is obliged to keep the refugee at the first point of entry. She was sent to this asylum seekers center at Osdorp. And this month, during the month of Ramadan, she was being told by the authorities that she must leave the center. Keep in mind, she had no passport, she had no facility with the language, she'd never been in the midst of winter, and she was with a 5-year-old son. And still the authorities had no interest in what she would do with herself. They just were rejecting her claim. And so the piece that we made together with the Somali community, called Ramadan Moon, was a weaving together of invocations from the hadiths from the time of Ramadan, in a way setting the space or the emotional subtext of her sense of what that time of the year must mean. And having done that in a sort of hopefully more somewhat poetic mode, one comes towards the end of the book to her actual story. And following her story, a set of revelations of the way in which not only the Somali refugees, but refugees in general have been treated in the Netherlands. It was a very heartening time. It was one of the few moments where I thought, oh, this could actually have a political impact. We mounted a conference in Amsterdam to which many of the judiciary and the mayor of Amsterdam and the Somali community all came. A 2-day conference. This was shortly before September 11th. I left thinking, oh, this certainly would be a positive step forward. I went back home to New York, and then September 11th happened. The next month, October, I was called by the lawyer, and he told me that Zainab and her son had been taken by force before dawn from the asylum center and put on board a plane bound for Tanzania. The notion was to dump her in Tanzania, where she had neither paperwork nor the opportunity to get back even to her homeland. The Somali lawyers mounted an appeal in the courts, and during the course of the flight between Europe and Tanzania, they ruled that she had been taken improperly, against the law. She was kept on board the plane, and 24 hours later, she was back at the Asylum Seekers Center in the Netherlands. Now, if you take one step back and you think, what does it mean for one who has, like myself, who has worked with her on a story? Was she perhaps chosen because her story was so well known, which is completely devastating to imagine? Was she, on the other hand, perhaps brought back to the Netherlands because her story was so well known? So these are the kinds of pitfalls I think one falls into when you try to predict the impact of your work. I've come to realize in the years since that I hope that it is a kind of invitation to a conversation. I hope that it furthers the issue. But I'm very timid about this notion of trying to assert a tangible sort of outcome. 7 years later, they finally approved Zainab's right to stay in the Netherlands. And she's given me these pictures. She, on the heels of winning the approval to stay, she was allowed to search for her 2 daughters who were living in a refugee camp in Ethiopia. And she won the right to bring them to live with her in the Netherlands. So the work that I'd conducted in Africa, in a way, was very much related to my father and the country of his birth. But his father was born in what had been the northern reaches of India along the Afghan border, what would later, after partition, become Pakistan, northern Pakistan. I'm his namesake. Sheikh Fazal was his name. He died when my father was only a teenager. And going back to Nairobi, Kenya, the place of my father's birth, I was always told about this sort of extraordinary sense of religiosity he had and his great philanthropy. But what I'd seen of the family legacy within one short generation had already been chipped away. And so I thought perhaps it would be interesting to try and go back to northern Pakistan, an area I'd never traveled to, and to search for the legacy left me by this man, Sheikh Fazal. Arriving in the borderlands, this actually is an image from Afghanistan. The Afghan poet has written, "The peoples became part of the faith, but were erased. So if the victor is weeping, O people of the world, only look at these cities that have turned to desolation. What I found when I returned to northern Pakistan was, of course, hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees who were living in what were now villages all along the border. And I began a piece, The Victor Weeps, which would carry me from 1996 to 1998, living in northern Pakistan and across the border in Afghanistan, documenting the voices of the refugee community and also writing more extensively about perhaps strains within me that might be bearing forward sensibilities from the East, things that I wasn't particularly attuned to or aware of, though I sensed they were there. And in these villages, it was a very volatile time. The way in which it would work was you would drive to the village and there was always a communal home that visitors could be settled in. And I would arrive with Abdul Sattar Hayat, my translator, and we'd be put in the room. The Shura, the Council of Elders, would gather in the evening, and they would ask why we were visiting. They would, of course, with great hospitality, inquire of our desire to document. And in each instance, actually, we were offered the opportunity to stay for many days or weeks, and then to return in the months thereafter. This is an image of Rohula, who had been a mujahideen in the fight against the Soviets. But the odd thing for a person like me, named Fazal Sheikh, was that I was seen at once immediately as a brother to them. But yet I'm an American, so I was also asked, what happened to your people? They were our brothers during those years of fighting, and the minute the Soviets left, they abandoned us. And so I found it very difficult to feel as though an apologist for my country. But it was an odd sort of duality, I must admit. One morning in one of these communal spaces, I had been taking testimonies, which, as you see in the exhibition here, forms a large part of my endeavor. But I had this experience, which I'll actually read to you from the book. It's called A Waking Dream. I'd been a guest for 5 days in the refugee village at Miram Shah in Pakistan. Following a night of discussion with the village elders, I slept in the same room where they had gathered with their stories. As the early morning call to prayer began, the men at my side stirred from their sleep and murmured to one another. They filed out into the dawn light to pay their respects to Allah, leaving me with the voice of the muezzin lingering in my ears. It lured me back to another morning, when I lay half waking just before dawn, only days after my mother's sudden death. I remember peering up at the ceiling, checking the quality of light as it began to make its trail across the room. I'd just begun to realize that her loss would be with me for the rest of my life. Its legacy would change with time, but the void it left behind would never be filled. Remembering that time, what came back to me with the greatest clarity and emotion was the dream that I had that morning. In my dream, I was traveling down a long corridor, some kind of ancient earthen passageway. As my gaze penetrated the depths, I came upon myself. Approaching from behind, I realized it was not just my body, but rather two bodies. As I entered myself, I felt that I was embracing and being embraced by another. I woke, still in the dream, with its force pulsating through my body. The second body I came to realize was my mother. In that dream, in that strange pre-dawn hour, had been a moment of empathy and mercy. Holding the experience close to my heart, I heard refugees tell of missing brothers, sisters, sons, and husbands. They remain in the dreams of the living. I think in the wake of that dream, it started to make me want to get closer to their sense of, as I've just said, that notion of what their own sense of loss was. That the image offered to me was also one that was borne forth by someone who remains, the kind of link to the past. I'll read you one of the dreams. This is of Korban Gul, who's holding and offering an image of her son, Mullah Awaz. She says, Mullah Awaz was my youngest son. In 1986, when he was 18 years old, his group of mujahideen attacked a communist post. In the exchange of fire, he was killed. Before the news of his death reached us, I dreamed that my son's body was being prepared for burial. When he had been washed and wrapped in white cloth, he was carried to the graveyard. They laid his body on the ground and turned his head toward Mecca. Then his body was covered with earth. After that, I did not dream of him again for several years. Then I became very ill and was taken to the hospital, where I lay near death. Then I had the second dream of Mullah Awaz. I was lying in my bed, and I could hear the door to my hospital room opening. Mullah Awaz peered in the doorway and walked toward my bed. He had a scarf draped about his shoulders. As he approached, he took the cloth from his neck and offered it to me. He told me to wrap it about myself. Then, without another word, he turned away and disappeared into the corridor. I covered myself with the scarf, and a sensation of warmth moved throughout my body. In the coming days, the illness left me, and I was able to return home. I never dreamed of him again. It's an image of Haji Abdul with his brother, Haji Ghulam Sadiq. A short dream. His father, Haji Ghulam Sadiq, and 5 brothers were martyred during the years of the jihad. It's a lucky family that offers the lives of their loved ones to the cause of Allah. They've brought great blessings upon us. It was 5 years after his death that I dreamed of my father. He sat at a great distance from me, looking away from where I stood. He was wearing a white turban and gazed off towards the horizon. I asked him where he was. He turned to me and said that I should not ask such questions, that I would meet him on the day of judgment. Seema and Shahima, sisters in the refugee camp at Nasir Bagh. Najiba, Abdul Shakur's wife. Osman and his brother Farid, they're blind qaris. A qari is a person who can recite the entirety of the Quran by heart. The book itself ends with a series of images of children born in exile. And as I mentioned, I worked there from 1996 to 1998. And when I came home and I'd finished the book, it was published, and then we had 2001 and September 11th. Coming back to New York City, the city of my birth, I was immediately seen as suspect. I've had to learn in the years since to realize that that will just be part of my life for many years to come, as I said to many of the people yesterday in the galleries who themselves have that same sense of being part of a vilified community or in any way linked to that community. And I thought also about, in the aftermath of September 11th, in the city of my birth, the Twin Towers being erected as I was growing up, proud to be a New Yorker and American, and also proud of the other strains that rest within me. I thought even if there needed to be retributive strikes in Afghanistan and Pakistan, I also realized that these strikes would be hitting some of the people, some of the communities that had given me such great hospitality during my years of visiting and working there. And that, for me, was something extremely painful to confront. The thing was probably even more painful was that I thought even if we needed to have those strikes, perhaps our nation could use that as a moment to reconsider the way in which we insert ourselves into other nations. But of course, in the years since, that has not proven to be the case. I decided not to go back to Afghanistan, to return to work there at the time. In many ways, I wouldn't have been able to visit in the same way the areas that I had visited those years prior during the ascent of the Taliban. But also perhaps given the sense that I would be witnessing another cycle of a kind of perpetual violence that has been visited upon that region and those people. In 2003, I read a small piece in the New York Times about the northern Indian city of Vrindavan. Vrindavan is the city, holy city for the Hindus, the playgrounds of Krishna, but it also happens to be the city to which widows migrate when they lose their husbands. And in reading about it, it was a short little piece, but it made me curious, this idea that these women who had been cast out of their homes, seen as having brought the ill luck that caused their husband's death, tossed out of their homes, in many cases the next day, and sent to Vrindavan. What a curious thing, the notion that the very religion that put them in this position is the same religion that they turn to for solace, comfort, and the hope of attaining moksha, which is, well, it's essentially our heaven. It's freedom from the cycle of death and rebirth. And I made a book, and the more comprehensive exhibition is, in a way, setting the stage of that space, firstly, before one looks at the individuals and listens to their voice. In Vrindavan, the threshold times, the moments just before and after sunrise and sunset, are the most sacred. And I felt, in fact, that the town was very much a sort of a stage set. This is an image of the Krishna icons and images of the Guru at rest. In the afternoon, within the temples, they would pull the veil in front of the icons in order that they could indeed rest. And in the book itself, it has a very particular cadence. I didn't like the notion that one immediately apprehends or one immediately has access to the women. I felt it was essential that we as viewers, readers, looking into a place that we knew little about, that we had to begin to understand the feeling for that place before we had the privilege of looking directly into the faces of the women. This is one of the earlier grids from dawn near the Bhajan ashram. The ashram itself, in which you see the lower left-hand image, is the women in a private prayer with their Krishna. If they chanted for the course of 8 hours during the day, they were given 5 rupees, which is a sort of 3 or 4 cent pittance. But the atavistic chanting of the thousands of women within those spaces was extraordinarily compelling. This is indeed one of the sessions of the chanting in the Bhajan ashram. Extremely atavistic. And then at some point I started with the women to take their stories, their testimonies of their lives, what had brought them to the town. The amazing thing that these Krishna icons, they were their lover, their child, their father, their sense of promise, in fact. And not only that, they had been shunned by their families, but they had also achieved this kind of sisterhood, this kind of new family within the embrace of the town, the religion, and the other widows, most of whom had endured similar histories. This is an image of Sevadasi, Lakshmi, Suniti Chatterjee. A small percentage of the women there actually, may know within Indian Hinduism this idea of the 4th phase of life. One shall turn away from worldly possessions and assume the life of an ascetic. And so many of the women, this Suniti included, she had children who were engineers and doctors who didn't want her to leave her home, but she wanted actually to spend the last years of her life in meditation in Vrindavan. About 2005, when that piece was finished, people asked me, well, this is clearly an antiquated mode. This is something about the prior generations. And so I thought, well, actually, it'd be curious to look at what it is today for the younger generations, young girls, children, and young women, what their stories might be like and what the situation indeed was for them. As you may know, in recent days, in fact, they've tried to chip away at the notion of child marriage. But that book, which I made, entitled Ludley, which means beloved daughter, is one of the more complicated pieces I've made, and certainly one of the more resonant and emotional passages in the exhibition here, because it includes testimonies of that are in many cases greatly painful. So how do you kind of weigh what is proper, what should you represent, when is a moment to photograph and when one shouldn't photograph? I had a very keen sense of that. Like, there are some times when you just don't photograph. And yet, you had to be also true to the nature of what you were visiting, what you were seeing. This is Sanjita from the Palna orphanage in Delhi. As you may know, great priority is placed upon having a male child, and the Palna orphanage had a crib outside the main gate to which families could come under cover of night and deposit if they had a girl child. Of course, throughout the northern swath of India, there are many instances of feticide, either by paying the midwife to smother the child if it's a girl, or having sonograms which have been made illegal but which still continue, and the summary aborting of the fetus, if indeed it is proven to be a girl. This is Simran in the homeless shelter. Labuben from the area around Chandigarh, Labuben was already married in what they call a Satalanya wedding to her cousin who is 18 years old. The idea of Satalanya has to do with a family marrying their child to another family member so as to keep the resources within the family. The Hindu boarding school, Manita. And one of the more extraordinary and heartening stories for me was when I visited this organization, Shakti Shalini. It was two women, one Muslim here, represented here, Shah Jahan Appa, and a Hindu woman, Satyarani Chadha. Both of their daughters had been burned to death in dowry deaths. They'd been promised, it's outlawed in India, the notion of dowry, but it's still customary. And the families of the groom, or the groom himself, were not satisfied with the dowry that was agreed and paid. And often is the case now, they claim that there's an accident in the kitchen while the woman is cooking, that her sari caught fire on the gas stove. And both of the daughters of Satyarani and Shah Jahan had been burned in this way. They had in fact proven that they had been doused with petrol before they were set alight, so it was clear that it was a killing. But when they'd gone to the police station and to the courts to try and gain redress, they realized that the husband's family had been paying off in each instance the necessary people so that it would keep him out of jail. And both of these women, in conversation with one another, they said, well, that's it. We're not going back to court any longer. We're not going to the police station. We're going together to reach across religious lines to create an organization that protects young women against such abuse so that they not experience the same history as their own daughters. For me, that was the most kind of extraordinary encounter, to meet women like that who had lived through such extreme pain in their lives, but yet were able to endure and create something positive for other generations. I won't dwell too much on this piece, but in 2010 or so, I went to Benares to make a piece called Ether, which in essence is about, well, sleep, dream, birth, and death. I took care of my grandparents and one of my parents during the course of long illnesses, and in my life of moving to the third world, I've always sort of been very close to death, and I see that as a natural progression, that we don't shun death in the third world, but yet in the States that's something to be kept at bay. And I sort of was interested also in looking at this space at Benares that is also a sacred space for the Jains and the Hindus. And as somebody who comes not from a religious background, but whose parents were Muslim and Christian, I sort of loved this notion that there was a chance to reach across and make a gesture on a human level. The images are very much about kind of a meditative space, moving through the town from midnight to dawn each night alone, wondering and thinking about that slip of space between what is sleep and what is death. It also happened to be the first time that I employed color feeling in a way that the town itself was a kind of a stage set, and the book, in a way, I hoped had a kind of a cadence that was engaging that kind of sense of emotion for me, let's say. And of course, it also happens to be the town in which people are brought for cremation along the Ganges. But that kind of moment wasn't so essential for me. What was more essential was this idea of honesty and openness to death. It was something that I felt very strongly for myself. This is an image of a child born the same day that a man has passed away, a diptych in the exhibition. I'll tell you very briefly about a more recent project in Israel-Palestine, where I worked for about 5 years until last year. I was invited, along with 12 other artists, to spend 6 or 8 months in the region and to produce what would be an exhibition and a book. I was initially very reluctant. I don't have any connection to the Middle East, but of course, by virtue of my name, I was worried about being instrumentalized. But I also realized that this would be the only opportunity for me to encounter that space with such freedom. And so I accepted at least the initial invitation and went under my own steam for 2 or 3 trips. And at some point I was exploiting this notion of being able to move with great fluidity across the borders between Israel and the West Bank, Palestine, and being given great hospitality on both sides of the border, and talking to commanders of those who had been combatants at the time of the start of Israel. It seemed to me like I had to create for myself a primer, and 48 was the most pivotal moment, in a defining moment, let's say, for the region. And it seemed obvious to look into the history. But when you would talk to the combatants, many of them, Israelis, would say, well, you know, we grew up next to these people. We were speaking one another's languages. And at 48, this rift was riven between us. And it is a scar that rankles to this day. And it's one that is so extraordinarily complicated to grapple with. And even as one is working as a visitor, you're already in the back of your mind censoring yourself for fear of trespass. But I told the people in the project that I actually had hit upon the thing that interested me. It was looking at the legacy of 48. And I started very simply going firstly to the places that had been sites of battle, but then finding that those places had also once been villages that were now evacuated, more than 450 of them. And so I went very simply to those sites. Many of them had been razed to the ground and completely erased. This is an image of Lifta, which is still much intact, right on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And I thought actually what was most interesting to me was to make a very formal image of the space, and then to also, without any real editorializing, just relate the facts of what had transpired in that space. And this book is Memory Traces about that. It's about going to those sites of memory, looking at what was subsumed beneath the surface of the land. But then I grew curious to try and follow somehow the thread across to the refugee camps where these people were now living and had fled 65 years prior. This is an image of Anissa, who was 103 at the time, in the northern Israeli Arab town of al-Fahim. The very odd sense that one could be the kind of conduit, right? I had the privilege to go to a place that they remembered so vividly from their earlier lives, but which they themselves could not travel to. A very difficult and privileged position, but also one which would allow me to explore their memories of place and in many instances bring images back to them or to conduct requests for them across the space in those areas. This is the interior of the Salama Mosque, right in the outskirts of Tel Aviv. I don't dwell on that piece much, but very much about Memory Trace, the first volume in that Erasure trilogy, is about what is subsumed beneath the land. And in fact, afforestation played a very big part of the way in which the landscape was transformed. In fact, today one, when trying to find those villages, often finds only a forest left behind. The second piece, called Desert Bloom, relates to that legacy of 48. I was invited to the south, to the Negev, to meet with Sheikh Sayach, the head of the Al-Turi clan in Al-Rakib, what was an unrecognized village that had been razed to the ground. And we sat in one of the blue, you can see them very faintly in the upper portion of the image. These are protest tents. This is the site of what had been the village. 50 houses which had been razed to the ground and the materials removed. And what one sees around that is the scarification of what are the troughs where seedlings were planted for what will be the ambassador forest. Ambassadors were brought from around the world to plant seedlings in this space. And when I sat in this protest tent with Sheikh Sayach, looking across the expanse of this space that had been the village in years prior, it's completely impossible to imagine that which he was telling me about the land. And it was the first time I ever felt the need to fly above a space, to record from the aerial perspective, God's eye view, what the context was. And in a way that work in the months thereafter was about interrogating the landscape without really knowing. What one sees here, the rectangle in the center, is the perimeter of the cemetery which had been left intact along with the protest tents. In the months past, the village itself was razed to the ground 100 times. They'd build the protest tents, the IDF would come the next day, raise them to the ground again and again and again to this day. And what one sees when you travel further across the southern expanse of the Negev is, for instance, in the upper left is a part of the troughs for the ambassador forest. You see the halo of what had been former Bedouin villages. You see the left top image is a Bedouin unrecognized village still intact. And the top right is again a part of the ambassador forest. Here you see the articulation, the architecture of what will be the forest in the time ahead, the larger squares to hold the water during the rains. So that work became, in a way, a kind of investigation into the notion of the desert blooming, the admonition by Ben Gurion to make the southern sweep of Israel bloom. I'd like to finish just with one piece which also relates to 48. I had always wished when I was there to be able to, I insisted upon the idea of working in both communities. And a leftist Israeli had said to me, well, you have to make a choice. And I never really accepted that. And so the last piece I made actually was trying to create a means by which to reach back to 48, to articulate that expanse of time, 65 years. And so I settled upon the idea of diptychs, one Israeli and one Palestinian, to represent every year from the year I was working back to 48. And so what you will see now is, without any comment, actually, pretty much, I'd like to just take you through that expanse, and then we're done. What was always curious to me was that idea that when viewing the book or the exhibition images, one has to choose which side to look to. You can't apprehend them both equally at the same time. And what does it mean when in one moment you look to one set of images and you feel an affinity for one group, and on another page you feel affinity for the other side? Thank you for listening.
We have microphones here and can take a couple questions if you have them.
I'd just like to say thank you for giving names to the photographs we were looking at. It makes it more like we're looking at the person, not just the photograph. Thank you.
Thank you. It seemed to me sort of a basic notion, but it's helpful.
Why did you have such a preference for shooting in black and white as opposed to color?
I think initially I sort of felt as though I see in black and white. It sort of felt more tactile, more sort of reducing things to the essential at a greater, perhaps, remove of contemplation, for me at least. I still feel that way very much with portraiture, and I don't think the palette of color is so much my thing. I mean, in fact, the times that I've worked in color have been very particular. You know, it's within that envelope of the night, the sort of quality of somber pastels, or the desert terrain, which is in another sense quite muted in its character. I think it just has to do with a kind of affinity for something tactile, maybe.
It seems like there must be a rhythm between a project like this one you just showed us, which sounds like it's come to fruition and completion, and then time in between, and then the next project. So one of the questions is, are you in a rest phase now, and do you know how the next thing will materialize for you, or are you already looking forward and involved in something? And maybe if over time there's been some rhythm between how you choose your projects or how they choose you.
Yeah, it's often you get this insufferable question the moment that you finish a book and you bring it out with such great pride, and people say, well, what are you working on now? It's like, oh, only 5 years of my life. But in fact, I think it's important to have a kind of rest phase, but also a moment to be open to what might strike you. And in the wake of working far longer in Israel, Palestine than I had intended, I only had to make one piece there, but one piece sort of naturally led to the next, which I'm very happy for, but it was a complicated time. Now I've come back to the States, what I didn't feel was necessary for me until very recently. So yeah, in most instances, it's a kind of a chance, happenstance that I see something that strikes a chord or raises a question that you're not sure about. I mean, I went most recently. I was invited when I was at a university on the East Coast, and I met a writer there who had asked me to come back and look at Utah, which I traveled to when I was in college and had no notion of what I could do there. But yeah, just kind of accepting something and taking a chance, and then seeing if it leads to a body of work that might be in sync with the trajectory of your own work. That was important also when you accept these sorts of invitations, often which are very generous. But I think you also have to realize that it's very possible you can fail. So I never felt comfortable with a kind of commission in that way. And Utah was that for me. It was the chance maybe to fail, but also the chance to see something new.
In your own retrospect, have you found anything in your pre-college years that might have directed you to this? I'm not sure. I mean, I still don't think that there's anything very special about the way that I'm working. It just seems kind of natural to me, so I'm always a little bit embarrassed by it. I mean, I love to do it and I love the chance to share it, but most of my choices seem really obvious. And I think that I learned, at Princeton, I learned this idea very much from Emmett, that you could use photography as a tool. I mean, when I was flippantly talking about self-portraiture, I mean, already then photography was a tool for exploring something. Of course, it was much more self-centered at that phase of life. But in the time since, it's been, turning your gaze outward and then try to figure out the world around you, what do different impulses mean, and interrogating them through the process of making. That for me is pretty important. But some students were asking me yesterday, just to close that question, I mean, how do you know that you can do it? And I remember that real sense of timidity. You'd love to do it, but you didn't think you had any chance to really pursue a life as an artist. And I think you just kind of give yourself time. Walker Evans said that you're supposed to give yourself 10 years of free time, which I don't think many people who would go to Princeton would be, the parents would be too enthusiastic about that. But, a certain set of years seems right. And I, is kind of rabidly stubborn working. So, but I still required a long time until I felt like I could say, oh, actually, that's what I do, and I can stand by that.
I'm just curious about this final series that you've presented. I believe you said it is culminating in a book. I'm curious if you intend to continue the series. It seems like it may culminate in a book, but it also seems like a series that could be ongoing through a whole career.
I think it could be, and it felt like, when I was swept into the void of working in Palestine, I thought, well, one thing leads to the next. I'm never going to move anywhere else. But no, I think that interestingly, like the desert bloom for me, those images are moments in time, pauses along a continuum. The piece, it's the last one, I didn't mention that, but it's called Independence Nakba. The only line in the book is that in the spring of each year, the Israelis celebrate Independence Day and the Palestinians commemorate the Nakba Day, the day of the catastrophe. And so, one could carry that on to now it's been, 70 years, 5 years later. But for me, the statement of that, what that means to watch the sort of wearing on the face and the sort of sense of looking between the two sets in the diptych is important. And no, I let that, I kind of let that be. Many projects are like that. It's difficult to decide for oneself when is the right time to stop. And I think in Israel and Palestine, I probably went beyond the time I should have stopped. Yes?
How and why was the title Common Ground selected?
It's drawn from my earliest book was called A Sense of Common Ground. And, particularly now, I very much like that simple invitation for people who are visiting the exhibition, looking into the eyes of those people, reading those testimonies, to be open to the sense that we could ourselves, given the wrong, let's say, set of circumstances in our lives, be in the same position. A sense of common ground, when I made the book in the 90s, it was about African refugee camps. And it was only, when Bosnia happened, that level of sort of pity somehow a little bit shifted, right? In Africa, it was a sense of, give money to assuage guilt, and that's warring could never happen in our society. But when Bosnia, was undone, it was suddenly, this is sort of a Western European context. But it was an insistence on something, a more fundamental human connection, I think.
Thank you very much. I've recently covered a couple of refugee crises. Can you, in any way, draw a distinction between photojournalism, long-form documentary photographic studies, and large-form artistic studies? Or are those distinctions completely artificial?
There was 1
Our
too many
last
questions.
question.
I think it was cut that guy out. I could say that for me, it's always been really important, that idea on insisting upon that there shouldn't be these kinds of divisions, that you can make something that functions in the artistic realm, in the documentary realm, and there should be a fluidity across those. I know it's not popular for that to be the case, but I'm very happy with that idea, and I insist, I love, like I said right at the outset, I love that, you can make a handsome, the way in which Julia did here, a handsome installation in the gallery space that honors and respects the individuals, and that communicates the care for them, and yet you can invite people, in this instance, into the galleries who wouldn't perhaps previously have visited here, and also take it into the street in the form of a newspaper. I personally have never been interested in the mode of photojournalism just because it didn't seem to be in sync with the way I wanted to work. Particularly in the time since I've been working, that whole mode has changed greatly, and you don't have the opportunity often, you might know better than I do, but to spend time exploring a place without knowing where you want it to lead. I hope that's okay. Anyway, I think that's sufficient. Thank you very much.